I'm Laura Richardson with Relevate, and we're bringing you another episode of our podcast. And today we are talking about something called a lien. So, a lien is something that can be attached to a property by a creditor or someone who feels you owe them a debt. But there are a lot of different types of liens. So, we're going to break those down for you so that you can understand how that hierarchy happens, as well as what does this mean if I go to sell my property. So, first of all, when you go to sell real property, you have to have zero encumbrances. So, things that are attached to the home that are owed prior to giving a clear title and deed. So when you have a lien, that means that credit, which again attaches to the property, not the person, that has to be cleared out at closing. So a part of the disclosure process in selling a home is to give all the facts and intel. One of which being, are there any debts owed on this property? So you're kind of probably wondering, well, why does that matter? Why does the future buyer even have to know about these things? Because at the end of the day, they can be paid out at the closing table. Well, it can get a little tricky because if there are big debts or multiple debts that are owed on the property, there may not be enough for the seller to clear funds, so they're now going in the red on what is owed. Or if there are any other additional people, like your real estate agents or the attorney, that has to be paid out of the same amount of proceeds, none of that can happen if we've already gone in debt to pay the debts. So the math has to math, right? So there are a couple of different types of liens that can actually affect property sales. So the first one is a mechanic's lien. So this is a security interest in the title to the property for anyone who has supplied labor or materials. So think of this kind of as your construction type of lien. So you guys build a pool in your backyard and then don't ever pay the contractors. Those contractors or even subcontractors of the person who built your house can attach that mechanic's lien onto the home. So something to also keep in mind in regards to payouts is that there is this hierarchy, if you will, of who gets paid first. So there's like an order of operations that the attorney will apply into what type of liens get taken care of first. So a mechanic's lien can definitely complicate the sale. It has to be paid or resolved prior to the closing. So a question that we often get is, well, what if I know I paid this vendor, but they've attached this lien to the property? So this can get a little tricky, but you want to try to go to the vendor, show the proof of payment, and get that resolved and have that judgment essentially removed. So the second one is a tax lien. So obviously this arises when you fail to pay any type of federal fees. The big one is like property taxes, for example. Those taxes then become affixed to the property and they are essentially going to be attached permanently until the property is then sold or these fees are paid off. So that's a big one. Judgment liens are another one. So these result from like a court ruling. So if a judge decides that there is a certain amount of funds that are owed, they can actually attach this to real property. This is kind of a broad group, if you will, but various judgments sometimes are needed to attach to a piece of real property that then has the amount, let's say in equity, that could pay off that at a later date. So that judgment lien is another option. Then we have mortgage liens. So what's funny about this one, and not funny in a ha-ha way, but just kind of ironic, is people don't realize the mortgage you have on your home is a lien. It is something that is owed to someone other than the homeowner, right? Because you went to a lender and you said, hey, lender, I'm going to borrow these funds so that I can purchase this property and I can live in it. Well, the lender wants their money back, right? So they attach a lien to the home in the form of a mortgage. So your promissory note that you sign at the closing table that you're basically saying, I promise to pay you back for the money you are lending me, hence lender. So that's also going to get paid out at the closing table. A mortgage lien is one of those that, again, it exists on pretty much every single house, and it's pretty normal for that not to get paid until closing. But what can be an interesting scenario is if you think back to like the 2008 recession, people went underwater on the lien that was owed because essentially what happened is, let's say you bought a house for $400,000 and you took out a mortgage for the entire thing. So you now owe $400,000 to a lender. Well, then when the market crashed, people were not able to sell their house for the same amount of money that maybe they bought it for. And if they didn't have enough equity to break even, so let's say that they sold it 6 months later for 300,000, you now still have 100 grand that you still owe this lender. This is where people ended up going into like foreclosure situations, and we saw a lot of short sales and things like that. So just know your mortgage is going to be owed, but that's typically paid out at closing. So how does this even affect the selling process? Well, usually during a title search, which basically is looking for anything that's attached to not give clear deeds, so these debts that are owed, that title search, which is something you pay for, it's a part of the process. The attorney does this via a title company. Here in North Carolina, we have both an attorney and a title company that work together. It's a part of that process. That will typically discover any liens owed on the property. It can cause delays in closing because sometimes we find out at the 11th hour that something was not paid for at the previous closing, or there's a debt that the seller was not aware of. This can also happen if you have different family members that were potentially living in the property at one point and are no longer living there. Even though they moved on, those debts are still owed and they may be attached to the property. So it can get rather complicated. There can be legal and financial ramifications from this. For buyers, sometimes that can delay closing, which can have a compounding effect, like your movers were paid to move on this day. Now they're having to do a storage fee to hold on to your stuff because we can't file to record because all of this has to be shaked out. So just know closing day is also something that doesn't always go smoothly because the unexpected kind of can happen at the last minute. So just some best practices for both buyers and sellers. Always seek professional advice from an actual licensed attorney. Your real estate agent can know a ton, but they are not an attorney. We are not allowed to practice in any way, shape, or form here in the state. We can't even amend contracts here and add in extra verbiage. So it's important that you're getting legal advice from somebody who actually has that title attached to their name. Always negotiate proactively to try to get these things resolved. And then the last thing is just prepare your mind and your heart for delays because, again, the unexpected should be expected. If you have any other questions about liens, what to do if you're facing that process with a lien or need potentially a recommendation for a good attorney to handle that, please feel free to drop those in the comments below, and we will see you guys on our next episode.